It has often been a matter of surprise to me that among the many cases which I chronicled during the years of my association with Sherlock Holmes there remain still some episodes of which the world has heard nothing. There were reasons of state which compelled me to lay aside more than one completed narrative, and there were other instances in which the scruples of private persons or of Holmes himself forbade any public record of our adventures. Of all such withheld histories there is none which press more heavily upon my conscience than the affair which I have ventured to entitle The Adventure of the Housekeeper's Contract. It touched not only upon the innermost workings of that vast machinery which men call government, but also upon the obscure grief of a solitary woman whose life had been overshadowed by the injustice of the powerful. Now that the actors have for the most part passed beyond the reach of earthly consequences, and the treaties then in question have been superseded by others, there can be no great harm in my setting down the facts as they came under my observation. I shall omit or alter certain names and localities, yet I shall adhere in all essential particulars to the strict truth as it presented itself to Sherlock Holmes and to myself. It was in the late autumn of the year, when the east wind had already begun to whistle shrilly round the corners of Baker Street, that this strange business first broke in upon the quiet of our rooms. The lamps had been lit for some time, and a thin drizzle veiled the street beyond the window, while Holmes sat coiled like some great lean cat in the armchair upon the hearthrug, his long fingers pressed together and his keen eyes half closed in abstraction. I had laid aside the evening paper, which contained little to interest beyond the common chronicle of petty crimes and parliamentary gossip, and was engaged upon some notes of my own, when our landlady announced a visitor.
"A lady to see you, gentlemen, and she will take no denial."
Holmes drew himself upright in his chair, and the old alertness sprang at once into his features.
"Show her in, if you please, Mrs. Hudson."
A moment later our door opened to admit a woman who at the first glance might have seemed the most ordinary of those faithful domestics upon whom the comfort of English households so largely depends. She was of middle height, sturdily built, and plainly yet neatly dressed in black, with a small bonnet and a shawl pinned closely about her shoulders, while her gloved hands were clasped tightly together as if to command the inward tremor that shook them. Yet there was something in the steady grey eye and the composed mouth which spoke of a spirit not easily daunted, and of habits of method and precision, such as one might look for in a confidential servant of long standing. Holmes had shot one keen, comprehensive glance at her, and now motioned her to the chair facing the fire.
"Pray be seated, madam, and tell us in your own fashion what has brought you to Baker Street at this late hour."
"Thank you, sir. My name is Martha Blake, and for 20 years I have been housekeeper to Sir Reginald Ashbridge in Belgravia."
At the mention of the name, I could not restrain a start, for even to a simple medical practitioner such as myself, it was well known in connection with certain important treaties in the colonial and foreign offices. Holmes's lids flickered for an instant, but his voice remained as quiet and cold as ever.
"You have done wisely in coming to us, Mrs. Blake, and I gather that some misfortune has lately befallen your employer."
"A misfortune indeed, sir, for this very morning he was found in a riverside warehouse in Wapping, lying in his own blood, with his skull broken, and he is now between life and death at the hospital."
The words were spoken without theatricality, yet there was in the woman's tone a depth of feeling that struck me with force. Holmes inclined his head slightly.
"Pray continue, and do not omit any circumstance, however trivial, that may seem to bear upon the matter."
"The police say it was a common robbery, sir, that he surprised some thieves in that warehouse, and that they struck him with an iron bar and rifled his pockets before they ran away into the fog by the river. They talk of dockside ruffians, sir, and say they will be caught, or not caught, as heaven pleases, and that is an end of it. But I who have kept house for Sir Reginald, and know his ways as I know the drawers of my own dresser, cannot and will not believe that it was chance that took him to that place, or common thieves that felled him there."
"On what do you base that disbelief, Mrs. Blake?"
"By this above all, sir."
As she spoke, she drew from the small reticule which she carried a folded document, which she held out with a hand that trembled despite her efforts at self-command. Holmes received it with an air of languid curiosity, which I knew to be assumed, and spread it upon his knee, while I, leaning forward, saw that it was a printed lease with blanks filled in by hand. The heading showed that it was an agreement for the renting of a warehouse by the river in favour of a small firm of colonial importers whose name was unfamiliar to me, and the signature at the foot was that of Sir Reginald Ashbridge.
"You recognise the writing, I take it?"
"I do, sir, as I recognise my own, for I have laid out his papers every day of my life, for 20 years. But I never saw this contract among them, not last night, when I set his writing table in order nor at any time before, and moreover it is not like him that the ink should be blurred as you see there by his name, for he was always very particular to sign with a steady hand.
Holmes had bent closer with his lens, and I could see from the tightening of his features that his interest had become intense.
You found this in his room after the attack?
Yes, sir, I found it on the carpet by his dressing table, and there is that upon it which is his blood, for I saw the stain upon his calf when they brought him home before they carried him to the hospital.
Holmes's eyes glinted.
Pray describe for us the course of events as far as they are known to you from the last night he was under your roof.
Sir Reginald has of late been much troubled in his mind, and I say, who have seen him under many burdens, in the service of the government. He would walk in his study long after midnight with papers in his hand, and twice I have seen him burn documents in the grate, which was never his habit. 3 nights a carriage came after the clocks had struck 12, and 2 gentlemen were shown into the study, and they remained with him for more than an hour speaking of shares and concessions and of some written understanding that should not trouble the house, and they left by the side door when all the rest of the house was asleep. This very morning he took his leather dispatch case and locked into it a buff-coloured envelope such as he always used for his most important papers, and he told me that he must see to a small matter of storage at the docks, and that I was not to wait luncheon for him. He went out in his overcoat and hat and walked away alone, and the next that I heard was that he had been found beaten near to death in the warehouse whose lease you hold in your hand.
She ceased and sat very upright, her lips pressed together, while the firelight gleamed upon the lines of care that seamed her homely face. Holmes had been examining the paper with his lens, running his finger along the lines and holding the sheet now to the lamp, now to the fire.
You're an observant woman, Mrs. Bligan. You have not misjudged the gravity of what you bring us. This is no common dockside affair, as the good gentleman of the yard may please to consider it.
He turned the document to the light, and his eye shone. Even to my less practised sight it was evident that the clauses towards the end had been cramped into a space originally too small for them, and that the ink there was distinctly of a greener hue than that of the main body of the lease. Holmes drew from his pocket a small tablet and a stick of chalk, which he rubbed gently over the back of the paper, then shook it so that a faint dust remained in the hollows of the fibres. From my chair I saw that there appeared upon the surface ghostly traces of words, as though some other sheet had once lain above this and had been indented upon it by the pressure of a pen.
Here we have harbour facilities and here coaling rights, and they're an island in the Mediterranean and a term of 99 years.
His voice had dropped into the eager half-whisper, which signified to me that his brain had leapt forward along some line of conjecture.
Pray tell me, Mrs. Bligg, has your master been at any time concerned with agreements touching upon foreign harbours and coaling stations?
I cannot say in detail, sir, but I know that his name has been mentioned in connection with some island place, for the newspapers spoke of him then as the saviour of the empire, and I heard him once say that he had added a stone to the foundations of our power at sea.
Holmes's fingers drummed lightly upon the arm of his chair.
You have done very well to lay this before us, and I will not conceal from you that it may be that larger issues are involved than even you suspect. Is Sir Reginald in a condition to receive visitors?
The doctors say that he drifts in and out of his senses, sir, and that quiet is everything for him. But if you and the doctor here think it right, I will take you to the hospital and ask that you may see him, for they near me there is his old servant.
We shall accompany you at once. What's in your hat and coat, if you please, for I think that in this case your professional eye may be of the first importance.
In 10 minutes we were in a cab rattling eastward through the shining streets, while Mrs. Bligg sat silent and rigid on the opposite seat, her hands folded tightly in her lap, and Holmes, leaning forward with his chin upon his hand, stared out into the rain-swept darkness with that faraway look in his eyes which told me that his mind was already sketching the outlines of a problem. The great stone pile of the hospital loomed up out of the mist, and we were presently conducted down a long whitewashed corridor where the faint odour of antiseptics mingled with the murmur of subdued voices and a distant clatter of wheels. At the end of this corridor a nurse with a grave face met us, and at a word from Mrs. Bligg admitted us into a small ward in which 3 beds were placed, and in the corner one lay empty, while upon another a man sat propped with pillows, and upon the third lay a figure so swathed in bandages that at first I could scarcely trace the human outline beneath. As we approached I saw that the skull had been trephined, and that a broad dressing covered the left side of the head, while the wasted features and grey moustache were those of Sir Reginald Ashbridge, whom I had once seen from a distance in a committee room of the house.
His eyes were closed, and his breathing shallow, yet at the murmur of our voices he stirred, and his lips began to form disconnected words.
Not again, not again. The 99 years they promised it was only to be harbour facilities. Martha must destroy it. They shall not bind the island forever. The Germans, they watch, they watch.
The rambling phrases fell from his lips in a low mutter, and the nurse glanced at me with a deprecating air. I could tell by the rise and fall of the pulse and by the flushed cheek that some irritation had been produced and that the damaged brain was in that perilous state when the least excitement may turn the scale towards mischief. I signed to Holmes that we must not remain long and was about to draw him away when the door opened sharply, and a man entered whose frock coat, the ribbon in his buttonhole, and the self-conscious gravity of his bearing proclaimed him at once as a servant of the Crown. He glanced from Holmes to myself and from us to Mrs. Bligg with an air which was compounded of annoyance and authority. Without looking at us, he addressed the nurse and the housekeeper. His words I shall not repeat exactly, but in substance he intimated that strangers must not be admitted to the bedside, and that any inquiries concerning Sir Reginald's condition should be made through the proper departments. There was that in his tone which betrayed more than the mere professional jealousy of an official for his prerogatives. Holmes regarded him with the expression of polite indifference which he assumed when he desired that his face should be as blank a page as possible to the eyes of an observer.
When we had withdrawn to the corridor, I could not restrain my indignation.
I asked Holmes what he made of this interference.
It confirms my impression, Watson, that we walk in very deep waters, and that some gentlemen who wear very good coats are extremely anxious that the public should not look below the surface. Come, we must return to Baker Street, for I would fain examine our good housekeeper a little further, and there is another mind besides my own that must be brought to bear upon this contract, and the shadow that lies behind it.
Once more we rattled westward through the rain and were soon again in the familiar warmth of our sitting room, where Mrs. Hudson had set a tray with coffee and a spirit lamp upon the table.
I thought you would be the better for something hot, gentlemen, on such a night.
You thought wisely as ever.
Holmes said this with a rare friendly intonation, but his eyes were already strained to the document which lay upon the mantelpiece. When our landlady had withdrawn, he took it up again and spread it flat, while Mrs. Bligg sat with folded hands upon the chair beside the fire, and I resumed my accustomed seat upon the opposite side of the hearth.
Mrs. Bligg, I shall ask you one or two further questions concerning your own history, which you'll perhaps consider impertinent, yet you may take it from me that they are vital to the proper comprehension of this affair.
You have the right to ask, sir, if you think it concerned, and I will answer as best I can.
You have served Sir Reginald for 20 years, as you said, yet you are not of the ordinary domestic class. You read documents, you arrange them, you distinguish handwritings, you observe watermarks, and you speak of the House and of committees with a knowledge that might be envied by many who sit upon the green benches.
My husband was a clerk in the Foreign Office, sir, before he died. It was my custom to help him in his work, when he was weighted with it copying and sorting and such like, and I learned something of the ways of departments and of the forms they use for their writings. When he died I was left with little money and less prospect, and it was by the goodness of Sir Reginald, who had known him as a young man, that I obtained my place in his house.
There was a certain stiff pride in her manner which forbade pity, yet in the slight quiver of the lips and the sudden tightening of the hands upon her lap I read the sign of an old wound not yet healed.
May I ask under what circumstances your husband died?
It was called self-destruction, sir. There had been some small leakage of information about a dispatch which concerned the South American matter, and, though there was no proof against him, he was blamed and told that he must resign or face public inquiry. He was a sensitive man, and very proud, and within a week he shot himself in his lodgings, leaving a letter to me in which he declared that he was innocent. No notice was taken of that letter, and his name has stood ever since as that of a man who betrayed his trust.
She spoke these last words with a cold intensity which made me understand that the smouldering resentment of years lay behind her outward composure.
You have my sympathy, Mrs. Bligg, for I have seen, too often, what clumsy hands are laid upon delicate reputations. Pray tell me now, have you at any time in your service with Sir Reginald seen papers that touched upon the island to which you alluded, and upon this matter of harbour rights?
I have seen drafts, sir, which he threw into the basket after he had copied or altered them, and I have laid my hand upon that name often enough as I sorted his papers for binding. I knew that what was said in the newspapers about an honourable and open treaty did not tally with the words I saw in those drafts, though I am but a woman and no statesman.
Holmes nodded slowly as if some inward chain of reasoning were being completed.
Watson, we must call in Mycroft.
The mere mention of that name was sufficient proof that the problem before us touched the very centre of things, for my friend's elder brother seldom stirred from the quiet seclusion of the Diogenes club save when questions of the gravest importance to the empire demanded his singular powers.
I will not disguise from you, Mrs. Bligg, that in following this matter to its root, we may find ourselves confronted by influences which neither you nor I can safely challenge alone. If you will leave this contract in my hands and return home for the present, I shall send for you when I have need of further information.
I place it in your keeping, sir, and I ask only that if there is any justice to be done from my poor husband or from my master who lies there helpless, you will not rest till you have done it.
I make no promises beyond this, that I shall pursue the truth as I see it without regard to fear or favour.
When she had taken her departure, Holmes wrote a brief note, which he dispatched by a boy messenger to the club in Pall Mall, where we knew that Mycroft would be to be found at the hour. Then he lighted his pipe and sat with his long legs outstretched staring at the ceiling, while the smoke wreathed itself in slow spirals above his head. Knowing his habits, I forbore to disturb him and busied myself with my medical journal until the heavy tread upon the stair and a familiar cough announced the arrival of the one man whose intellect Holmes was ever ready to acknowledge as superior to his own.
You do not often drag me from my armchair, Sherlock, so I presume that you have found something which touches the Admiralty, India, the Treasury, or all three at once.
You will find that your presumption is not far astray, Mycroft.
The mere mention of the Admiralty and of the Treasury was enough to show me that the matter before us must be one of singular importance. Mycroft Holmes, whose massive form seemed to overfill the modest chair, took the document and adjusted his spectacles upon his broad nose. I watched his face as he read and saw the heavy lids lift slightly, while the great brain behind them leaped to its conclusions.
This is a clumsy business, Sherlock. Whoever drew this forgot that even the smallest pebble dropped into a pool will send ripples to the edge.
You recognise the handwriting?
The body of it is that of some solicitor's clerk, as any fool could see, but this inserted clause about sealed government consignments is taken almost word for word from a standard Admiralty form which is not to be purchased at any stationer's. And these indentations upon the back, which you have been clever enough to bring out, speak of a projected lease of harbour facilities and coaling rights in the island, of which we have lately heard too much. I gather that Sir Reginald has been playing a double game between his sense of honour and some very pressing influences.
You gather correctly as far as the present evidence goes, although we know little yet of the nature of the influences and nothing of the hand that struck him down in that Wapping warehouse. I sent for you to learn whether this business of harbour rights has been revived in any recent negotiations.
There has been some talk among certain gentlemen in the city and one or two in the house of a bold stroke by which that harbour should be practically granted to a private syndicate under the cloak of a commercial lease. Their plan is to bind the government morally by an understanding not submitted to Parliament, while keeping the legal form in the hands of a company which can be disowned if the need arises. It is a pretty manoeuvre, and there are foreign eyes watching it with malicious interest.
And so Reginald?
He is one of the few men whose signature and influence would be necessary to give the scheme a respectable face. If he hesitated, if he spoke of conscience, if he remembered his first treaty, then some people might be very desirous to stiffen his resolution or to silence him altogether.
You have a turn of phrase, Mycroft, which would have graced the criminal bar had you not elected to sit behind the scenes and pull the wires.
I pull no wires, Sherlock, and I shall be obliged if you will keep me entirely out of whatever net you are weaving. This is no case for you at all, and I strongly advise you to leave it in the hands of those whose duty it is to manage such affairs.
It is precisely because those hands appear to have fumbled it that I find myself unable to follow your advice. A woman whom I respect has appealed to me, and a man lies smashed in a warehouse without any explanation consistent with robbery and ruffianism alone. You know me too well, Mycroft, to imagine that I shall let such a problem pass me by.
Then at least tread carefully, for there are men concerned here who can strike harder than any dockside bully and with less fear of the law.
I have never found fear of the law to be a particularly active motive among the classes who make the laws.
A faint smile twitched at Mycroft's lips, but his gaze remained anxious.
You will do as you please, of course, but do not expect me to applaud. If you drag some prominent name into the mud, you will find that the mud splashes you as well.
I am accustomed to a little dirt upon my garments so long as my hands remain clean.
With a gesture of resignation, Mycroft rose and took his leave, lumbering down the stairs to his cab while Holmes stood at the window watching the glow of its lamps recede into the rain.
He then turned to me with the brisk air which always heralded immediate action.
Watson, we must see the warehouse for ourselves before the trail grows cold. Lestrade will no doubt be delighted to show us how simple his case is.
It was still early on the following morning when we presented ourselves at the police station nearest to the river and requested to see the inspector in charge of the Wapping assault.
Well, well, if it is not Mr. Holmes and Dr. Watson descending from the clouds upon my poor little case. I suppose you are going to tell me that it was not robbers after all, but the Prime Minister in disguise.
I seldom predict until I have seen the ground, Lestrade. If you can spare the time to conduct us to the warehouse, I shall be obliged.
It will be our pleasure to show you that there are still 1 or 2 crimes in London which do not require your microscope.
Lestrade was as good as his word, and before long we were threading the narrow lanes that lead down to the wharves, where the brown tide lapped sluggishly against green slimed walls, and where tall masts and derricks loomed like spectral trees through the river mist. The warehouse in question was a gloomy building of brick and timber with a gabled roof and small windows that stared blankly out upon the water. A constable admitted us with a key, and we found ourselves in a large open chamber where rows of crates and barrels were stacked in orderly fashion, leaving a passage down the middle to the wooden stair that led to the upper floor. The faint light from the high windows showed a dark patch upon the boards near the foot of the stair, and I shuddered as I thought of the blow that had fallen there.
There you have it, Mr. Holmes. Sir Reginald comes down here alone. He surprises some fellows prizing open the cases. He tries to stop them, and one of them takes that iron bar from the corner and gives him a tap on the head. Then off they go by the river door with his watch and purse, and that is the long and short of it.
You interest me in spite of yourself, Lestrade. These cases here, what do they contain?
The labels say machinery and grain and such like. We have not opened them, for it is no business of ours so long as they are properly entered for duty, and I have the papers to show that they are.
Then it is contrary to your practice to verify the contents of a suspected warehouse.
One cannot be prying into honest trade all day, Mr. Holmes. We look for the men who used that iron bar, and when we find them the case will be finished.
While he talked, Holmes had been moving with that quick, noiseless step of his, examining first the barrels, then the cases, and finally the stair itself. He knelt beside the dark patch upon the floor and passed his thin hand lightly over the stained boards.
You see, Watson, the blood has soaked most deeply in this narrow crescent, which shows that the head rested here, while the body lay along this line. Now observe the mark upon the lowest step, where the grain of the wood is bruised as by the edge of a boot. From this I deduced that the blow came from a man who stood 1 step above Sir Reginald, and that he struck downward with some heavy instrument probably held in both hands.
I followed his indication and could not but admit the justice of his reasoning. He then mounted a few steps and sniffed delicately at the handrail.
Here is a faint smear of grease with the odour of a fine gun oil, and mingled with it the unmistakable fragrance of a certain expensive Turkish cigarette which is much affected in the West End and very little in Wapping.
He drew from his pocket the lens and indicated to me a tiny fragment of dark cloth which had caught upon a projecting nail in the stair.
This is from a coat of good West Country broadcloth, and not from the rags of a dockland ruffian.
He moved forward to a small inner door beside the stair, the lock of which showed fresh scratches. Inside we found a little counting room with a high desk, a stool, and a row of dusty ledgers upon a shelf. Holmes's attention was at once fixed upon a patch of clean wood behind the lowest shelf, where a rectangular outline could be seen in the dust.
There has stood here a box of some weight, and it has been lately removed.
He pointed to the floor where the dust was stirred in a pattern of small marks.
It was dragged out carefully, then set down and open, I fancy, and lastly carried away by 2 persons, each taking an end.
You can make as much of dust and nails as you please, Mr. Holmes, but the watch and purse are missing, and 2 lads from the river side were seen hanging about this place that morning, and they have not been heard of since. You will forgive me if I say that your fine gentlemen may smoke Turkish cigarettes, but they do not go about breaking skulls in warehouses.
On the contrary, Lestrade, it is precisely what they may do when their contracts are in danger.
The inspector shrugged his shoulders with the air of a man who has done his duty and is not responsible for the extravagances of others. He left us presently to pursue his inquiries in his own fashion, while we remained a while longer in the dim interior of the warehouse. Holmes paced slowly among the cases, his eyes roving over label and cord, while his fingers fluttered now and then upon some trifling object which he slipped into his pocket for later examination.
There is one point upon which I am still uncertain, Watson, and that concerns our admirable housekeeper.
I asked in astonishment what doubt he could possibly entertain regarding the honest and courageous woman.
Honest, yes, and courageous, beyond question, but she's more than a housekeeper, and it is not yet clear to me in what capacity she has chosen to intervene in this drama. It will be necessary to watch her movements for a day or two.
I confess that I protested warmly against any shadow of suspicion being cast upon Mrs. Bligg, but Holmes, with his usual cold logic, pointed out that it is not the business of the reasoner to be tender-hearted.
I do not say that she is our enemy. On the contrary, she may very well prove to be our ally, but I must know on which side of the board she truly stands.
That same afternoon, we arranged our little system of observation, by which certain friendly persons in the neighbourhood of Belgravia were instructed to report to Holmes any unusual movement at the house of Sir Reginald. On the following evening, when the fog lay thick in the streets, a message reached us that the housekeeper had been seen to leave by the area door dressed for walking and to take an omnibus that ran eastward.
Without the loss of an instant, Holmes snatched his coat, and we hurried out into the night.
You will come, Watson, for this part of the play promises to be of the most delicate interest.
We took a cab, and by judicious shortcuts and a good knowledge of the omnibus route, Holmes contrived that we should alight in time to see Mrs. Bligg step down at a crowded junction and transfer herself to a second vehicle, which bore her towards the river. Thereafter we followed on foot, keeping always at such a distance that she could not suspect that she was watched. She walked with a firm, unfaltering step through streets that grew meaner at every turn until the smell of tar and of stale fish gave notice of the riverside.
At length she turned into a narrow alley and passed through the door of a small coffee house whose windows were clouded with steam and tobacco smoke.
Holmes and I took our stand upon the opposite side of the street, whence through a crack in the blind we could command some view of the interior. We saw that Mrs. Bligg seated herself at a corner table, and that a minute later she was joined by a small spare man with a pointed beard and a sallow, eager face, who carried his hat in his hands and bowed over hers with the air of one who pays his respects to a superior. Holmes's hand gripped my sleeve.
You see the man, Watson?
I answered that I did, and asked whether he was known to him.
I have met him before in connection with certain railway plans which interested a foreign government. His name is Albrecht, and he has the misfortune to serve two masters at once.
It was impossible for us to hear their words through the closed window and the murmur of many voices, but we could mark the gestures and the changes of expression upon their faces. Mrs. Bligg spoke quietly and steadily, while the man opposite her showed in every line of his features excitement, eagerness, and even a kind of fear. Once he made as if to leave the table, but her hand came down upon it with a firmness that checked him, and he resumed his seat with the air of one who is compelled against his will. At last she drew from her reticule a folded paper and held it poised between her fingers, while the other stretched his hand for it like a starving man for bread. She seemed to make some condition, for he hesitated, then nodded reluctantly, and she replaced the paper in her bag without having parted from it. They rose and left the house together, and we followed them once more through the misty streets until they parted at a corner where he took the road towards the city, while she turned homewards in the direction whence we had come. Holmes stood for a moment at the corner watching the retreating figure of the man.
We have seen enough for tonight, Watson. Let us return to Baker Street and invite Mrs. Bligg to favour us with a little more of her confidence.
It was perhaps an hour later when the bell rang at our door and our vigilant landlady ushered the housekeeper into our room once more.
You sent for me, sir, and I judge by your note that it was urgent, so I came as quickly as I could.
You have done rightly, Mrs. Bligg. Pray be seated.
Holmes's manner was courteous, yet there was in his eye that steely glint which warned me that some crisis had been reached.
You will not be surprised to hear that I know with whom you have been taking coffee this evening.
I did not suppose that anything could long remain hid from you, Mr. Holmes. If you know that, then you know also that I have not sold my country, for it is not to sell that I hold what I hold.
I know that you met Herr Albrecht, who's a known agent of a foreign power and a suspected intermediary for our own, and that you showed him a paper and withheld it until he gave you some promise. I know also that you have in your possession a document more dangerous to certain gentlemen in London than a loaded pistol aimed at their heads.
You speak truth, sir, and I will tell you the rest, for I see that there is little use in any further concealment. After my husband's death and the cruel way in which his name was smirched, I vowed in my own heart that if ever I could, I would make those suffer who had used him as a scapegoat to hide their own carelessness. When I entered the house of Sir Reginald, I saw soon enough that he was an honourable man, harassed and hampered by others less scrupulous, and I bore him no ill, although he was one of the department that had cast my husband aside. Yet I learned from my handling of his papers that there were schemes afoot which were not honest schemes, and that the same kind of men who had ruined my husband for a trifle were now ready to stake the peace of the empire for their own gain. I am no politician, Mr. Holmes, but I can read plain English, and I saw that under the fine words of the treaty for that island there lurked another understanding one that would bind our country for 99 years to a bargain which, if it were known, would set every rival power in arms. So when I came upon drafts, letters, and other writings that spoke plainly of what they meant to do, I copied them with my own hand, and I kept them by me against the day when they might be needed.
You then set yourself to practice upon a small scale the art of espionage, which you had learned in the antechambers of the Foreign Office.
Call it what you will, sir, I call it taking care of my own and of the truth. When they began again of late to press Sir Reginald to lend his name to a fresh contract under which a company was to hold the harbour as if it were a private wharf, I understood that the danger had returned. Sir Reginald is an old man now and weary, and they thought perhaps that he would sign what they put before him without reading for the sake of an easy mind and a quiet end. But he has a conscience, and of late he has been torn between that and the pressure brought upon him. I saw that he slept ill and that he burned papers, and I guessed that he was struggling to rid himself of what he had done in the past and to avoid fresh entanglements. Then I resolved that if they would not do justice of their own accord, I would compel them to it.
You chose Herr Albrecht as the lever with which to move them.
He has friends both here and abroad, Mr. Holmes, and he is greedy for information, which he may sell to either as it best pays him. I knew that if I could make him aware that there existed a paper signed by great men in London, which proved their willingness to barter away that harbour his very eagerness, to profit by it would frighten them more than any threat of mine. So I let it be known to those who talk in clubs and corridors that a poor housekeeper had in her keeping a certain contract, and that she would use it if need were. They were not long in finding out where I lived, and in sending to me secret messages, some begging, some threatening, and others offering me money if I would surrender what I had. I answered none of them directly, but I sent a word to Herr Albrecht that if he would undertake to deliver my demands to those whom it concerned, I would show him some part of the truth.
Your demands were that your husband's innocence should be acknowledged, and that some provision should be made for your own future.
Yes, sir, no more than that, and I will add that I would never have gone beyond a hint of what I knew if they had not driven Sir Reginald almost to madness with their continual importunity. He spoke in his sleep of their visits, and of the paper they wished him to sign, and when he went out with his dispatch case that morning, I understood that some final step was to be taken. What I did not foresee was that they would add violence to fraud.
Her eyes flashed for an instant, and her strong, capable hands closed upon each other until the knuckles showed white.
You believed then that he went to the warehouse to meet them, and that they seized the occasion to rid themselves of a dangerous witness and to recover the documents.
I believe so still, Mr. Holmes. They may dress it up as they please, but I know that Sir Reginald never sought out low company, and that he would not of his own free will have set foot in such a place unless he had been driven there by those who could command him.
You have been a very bold woman, Mrs. Bligbold, and shrewd, though I cannot approve all the means by which you have sought to right your wrongs. If you continue without guidance, you may at any moment throw into the hands of a foreign agent a weapon, which he will use not as you intend, but to the grievous hurt of the country, which in your heart you desire to serve.
That is why I come to you now, sir, for I felt when I saw Sir Reginald lying there that the matter had gone beyond me. I will put what I have into your keeping if you on your part will not let those who brought him to that state escape without some punishment.
I cannot promise you the kind of punishment which the law deals to common thieves, but I may be able to secure that they do not profit by their villainy, and that some tardy justice is done to the dead clerk whose widow has borne so much. You will give me then this paper which you have shown to Herr Albrecht.
I will give you a copy of it, sir. The original lies where no foreign agent can come at it.
That is well, and you will hold no further communication with your bearded friend unless it be at my suggestion or with my knowledge.
I consent to that, Mr. Holmes, for I am weary of standing alone.
With a grave inclination, Holmes accepted from her a folded sheet closely written in a small upright hand, and when she had left us, he and I bent over it together in the lamplight.
It was indeed a formidable document, for in plain terms and with dates, names, and sums it set forth the history of the projected 99-year lease by which a group of financiers and a certain cabinet minister whose name I express proposed to secure for their own profit the harbour, which outwardly had been declared free and open under the public treaty. Sir Reginald's share in the affair was clearly indicated as that of a man whose technical knowledge and official reputation were necessary to give a colour of regularity to the scheme.
Yet it was also evident that he had drawn back more than once, and that his reluctance had at last become so obstinate that threats were employed.
Holmes folded the paper thoughtfully.
Here, Watson, is a little private blue book compiled by a housekeeper, which would have published make more noise in Europe than many a volume of official correspondence. We must handle it with great delicacy.
He rose and paced the room, his long arms swinging and his head sunk upon his breast.
We have to deal with two groups of persons. First, with the conspirators themselves, who have shown that they are not afraid to strike in the dark, and second, with the guardians of the public safety, who are more afraid of scandal than of crime. Between the two, it will not be easy to secure that any justice is done to our good Mrs. Bligg.
I asked how he proposed to proceed.
We must first complete our reconstruction of what occurred in the warehouse. There are still some missing links, and I shall go there alone tonight in the hope of finding them.
I protested against his exposing himself to danger, but he only smiled that thin, mirthless smile of his.
My dear Watson, you forget that I have been in more perilous places than a Wapping warehouse. You will remain here in case any message arrives from Mycroft or from the hospital, and I shall be back before morning if all goes well.
It was near midnight when he set forth, and I confess that I passed some anxious hours in our sitting room, starting at every sound in the street below and listening for his foot upon the stair. At last, when the clock upon the mantel had struck 3, the door opened, and he entered pale with cold and his clothes glistening with the damp of the river fog, but with a light in his eyes that told of success.
The ground is firmer under our feet, Watson. I have found what I went to seek.
I begged him to tell me what discovery he had made.
First, I have confirmed beyond doubt that the warehouse is held not by any genuine trading company, but by a dummy firm whose shares are in fact controlled by the same financial house which has been most active in pushing this 99-year scheme. I found in a hidden recess behind the place where the steel box had stood a torn corner of a letter bearing the crest of that firm and the date of last week. Second, I have traced upon the dust 2 sets of footprints that are not those of police or porters, for one pair bears the peculiar half-moon marking of a fashionable bootmaker in Pall Mall, while the other shows the flat broad heel of a military riding boot. Third, I have discovered upon the underside of the stirrafane smear of blood at the point, which could only have been touched by the weapon as it swung downwards, thus confirming our inference as to the direction of the blow. Lastly, and perhaps most suggestive, I have found upon the floor of the counting room a small fragment of blue sealing wax, such as is used in certain departments to secure official envelopes.
These details he laid before me with that scientific precision which I had so often admired, and I could see that while they might seem trivial to a casual eye, they formed in his mind a connected chain, which pointed to some definite conclusion. Before he could say more, however, there came a knock at our door, and Mrs. Hudson entered with a card upon a tray.
I took it up and read the name of the cabinet minister whom Mycroft had hinted to us without uttering it.
Holmes's eyes gleamed.
The fish has taken the flyer, Watson.
A moment later, the great man himself was in our room, his heavy face pale, and his manner constrained, though he endeavoured to cover his uneasiness by an assumption of dignity. I shall not repeat his words, for they were couched in guarded phrases, and would convey little to any reader who was not acquainted with the inner ramifications of politics. In effect, he pointed out that the matter of Sir Reginald's assault was one in which the government took a natural interest, that delicate negotiations were in progress, and that it was most desirable that no irresponsible person should cause embarrassment by premature or unauthorised action.
He hinted that if Holmes would abstain from further investigation, there were many ways in which a man of his talents might be of service to the country, and that such service would not go unrewarded. Holmes listened with an expression of polite boredom, which I knew to be assumed, yet under which there lurked a contempt that was not wholly concealed.
You ask a good deal, sir. You ask that I should abandon a case in which a helpless man has been struck down by ruffians who are perhaps above the reach of the ordinary law, and that I should betray the confidence of a woman who has placed her whole life in my hands. In return, you offer me the prospect of some vague future favour.
The minister reddened and his heavy hand closed upon the head of his umbrella.
His reply was couched in terms of rebuke and warning, but Holmes cut it short with a gesture.
You must understand, sir, that there is no power in England that can compel me to do false to my own sense of right. If you wish to avoid scandal, the surest way is to see that justice is done before the public has occasion to demand it.
The interview ended in a manner which showed me how vain it is to attempt to impose upon my friend by any appeal to his ambition or his fears.
When the minister had gone, Holmes turned to me with a shrug.
We shall now have all the hostility that the government machine can exert short of open persecution. It becomes the more necessary that we should strike quickly and decisively while the facts are still in our hands.
It was at this point that Mycroft once more intervened. He came in person early on the following day, his usually imperturbable features more lined and anxious than I had ever seen them.
You have been visited, I hear, by our eloquent friend from the cabinet.
I have, and I fear that I did not contribute greatly to his comfort.
You seldom contribute to the comfort of departments, Sherlock, and I begin to think that you enjoy your reputation as a thorn in their flesh.
A thorn may sometimes prevent a man from sitting down too heavily upon something which he ought to respect.
You are playing with fire. There are forces here which you cannot bend to your will as you bend a private criminal.
Then I must induce them to bend to their own interests, which for the moment happen to coincide with those of justice. Listen, Mycroft, for we have not much time.
In a few rapid sentences he sketched the results of his nightly expedition to the warehouse and laid upon the table the fragment of crested letter, the piece of sealing wax, and the rough diagram of the footprints which he had made upon his cuff. Mycroft examined them with his habitual thoroughness.
You have made out a strong case against certain persons whom we will not name. If this were to come before a court, the most that could happen would be that some highly placed men would be discredited and perhaps driven from office. But I need not tell you that there are other courts besides those which sit at Westminster, and that there are ways of settling such matters which never appear in the newspapers.
I seek no headlines, Mycroft. I ask only that Mrs. Bligg's demands be justly met, that her husband's memory be cleared, and that Sir Reginald be no longer hounded into dishonour.
You will make those demands to the very men whom you accuse, and you will expect them to yield.
I shall not rely upon their generosity. I shall provide them with a more cogent motive. It is my intention to stage a little drama in that warehouse by the river, in which they shall be forced by their own fears to accept terms which they would otherwise reject.
And you propose that I shall assist in this theatrical performance?
I propose that you shall be present as the representative of that part of the government which still believes that the honour of England is worth preserving.
You take too much upon yourself, and I am not sure that I shall consent.
If you do not, Mycroft, the field will be left wholly to those whose idea of honour is measured by pounds and shillings. You know as well as I that the publication of Mrs. Bligg's paper in certain foreign capitals would be a disaster of the first magnitude. If she were an adventuress or a fool, it might be impossible to restrain her, but she is neither, and I have her promise that she will put herself in my hands. I offer you a chance to turn a sordid intrigue into an occasion for clearing away some abuses and for doing simple justice to a wronged man.
Mycroft sat for some time in silence, his great head sunk upon his breast while the ash of his cigar grew long between his fingers.
You are an unpractical visionary, Sherlock, and you meddle where wiser men hold their tongues. Nonetheless, you are sometimes right. I will be at your warehouse at 9 o'clock tonight, and I will see that there are certain discreet persons within call who may serve as witnesses if need be.
That is all that I asked, Mycroft.
Thus it came about that on that foggy evening Holmes and I once more took our way down to the river, where the lamps glimmered faintly and the brown water swirled and gurgled among the piles. Lestrade was waiting for us within the warehouse, his thin ferret face peering out anxiously from the shadow of a stack of crates.
I do not like this, Mr. Holmes, and I tell you frankly that if there is any mischief, I wash my hands of it. I am here because certain persons high up have requested that I should be, but it is not the sort of business that our regulations cover.
You will find, Lestrade, that your regulations are elastic when it is the interest of your superiors that they should be so. All that is required of you is to stand where I place you and to observe what passes.
A few minutes later, Mycroft appeared wrapped in a heavy ulster, his great form looming through the doorway.
He greeted us with a curt nod and took his place at a corner where he could see without being readily seen. The fog had crept even into the interior of the warehouse, so that the farther end where the river door opened was veiled in a grey haze, and the lamps which Lestrade had caused to be lighted cast long wavering shadows between the stacks of merchandise.
At 9:15, Mrs. Bligg arrived walking, with the same firm step and composed bearing that I had already noted.
I have done as you asked, Mr. Holmes, and I have sent the message to Herr Albrecht that he is to meet me here, and that I shall bring with me the paper he desires to see.
You have that paper upon you.
I have, sir.
You will presently show him a corner of it, and no more, and you will then insist that he bring with him those to whom he has spoken of it. You have made it plain that you will not treat with underlings.
I have put it to him in that way, sir, and I think he will not come alone.
Then we must to our posts, for the players are at hand.
We concealed ourselves as best we could among the cases near the counting room, leaving a clear space in the centre of the floor where the meeting would naturally take place. I confess that my heart beat somewhat faster than usual as I crouched, their pistol in hand, for I knew that desperate men might be driven to desperate measures if they found themselves trapped. The slow minutes passed, and then from the riverside there came the faint creak of a door and the sound of cautious footsteps upon the boards.
Through a chink, I saw Herr Albrecht step into the light, followed by two other figures whose outlines, even in the mist, were not unfamiliar to me from caricatures and photographs.
One was the cabinet minister whose card I had seen upon our tray, and the other bore upon his coarse florid features and thick neck the stamp of the successful man of money. With them came a fourth whose bearing and the faint clink of spur upon board told of the soldier. These last I shall not more particularly describe for reasons which must be obvious.
You have chosen an odd trysting place, madam, and one that is not agreeable to my friends.
It is their own choice, Herr Albrecht, for it was they who took a lease of this warehouse, and it is here that they sought to settle their business with Sir Reginald. If the place is gloomy, they have themselves to thank for it.
The minister's deep voice sounded harshly through the gloom, but his words I shall render only in substance.
He reproached Mrs. Bligg for her presumption in meddling with affairs beyond her station, hinted that she might be prosecuted for attempting to blackmail those whom she should have been proud to serve, and demanded that she surrender at once any papers which she had taken clandestinely from Sir Reginald's possession.
I have taken nothing that is not mine by right. The paper I hold was written with my own hand, and if there are words in it that came first from the pens of greater men, they have best asked themselves how those words would look if read aloud from the opposition benches or printed in a foreign journal.
The financier broke in with bluster, but I saw in the shifting of his eyes that fear had already laid its hand upon him.
The soldier stood rigid and silent, his jaw set.
The matter is simple. The lady has a document. She desires justice for her husband and security for herself, and she prefers to obtain these from her own government rather than from any other. It is for you to say whether you will make terms or whether you will allow that document to travel farther than you would like.
The minister turned upon him with anger, yet the very violence of his tone betrayed his inward alarm. Again, the details of his speech are not necessary.
Enough that after much argument muttered aside between him and the man of money, and more than one glance towards the misty corners of the warehouse, they declared themselves ready to consider certain concessions.
At that instant Holmes rose from behind the crates and stepped into the circle of light.
You will find, gentlemen, that it is not sufficient to consider you must commit yourselves, and you must do so under the eyes of witnesses whose word will be believed when yours is doubted.
There was a sharp exclamation, and the financier sprang back with his hand to his breast, while the soldier's arm jerked as if to seek a weapon, but Lestrade had already covered them, and Mycroft moved from the shadows with the slow, ponderous restraint of one who's master of himself and of the situation.
You may spare yourselves the trouble of protests. I have heard enough to satisfy me that this matter must be settled here and now. You will sit at that desk and you will sign such documents as Mr. Sherlock Holmes may place before you, and afterwards you will thank heaven that you have escaped more easily than you deserve.
I had never before seen Mycroft thus moved, and there was that in his cold, deliberate utterance which cowed even the boldest of our unwilling guests.
Holmes seated himself at the high desk and drew from his pocket several sheets which he had evidently prepared in advance.
These are brief memoranda. In the first, you acknowledge that certain expressions were inserted into drafts concerning the harbour, which went beyond the public treaty, and that these expressions were never formally ratified and will never again be proposed. In the second, you admit that harsh and unjust measures were taken against a subordinate clerk in order to divert attention from the negligence of others, and you recommend that his name be cleared in the official records and that some pension be granted to his widow. In the third, you undertake that Sir Reginald Ashbridge shall not again be pressed to lend his authority to any scheme connected with the harbour, and that he shall be permitted to end his days in honourable retirement. You will sign his memoranda.
They hesitated, and again there was muttering and shrugging, but the presence of Mycroft and of Lestrade, the gleam of the pistol in the inspector's hand, and above all the knowledge of what lay Mrs. Bligg's reticule prevailed. One after another they seated themselves at the desk and affixed their signatures, their pens scratching nervously in the silence.
When the last had done so, Holmes folded the papers and handed them to Mycroft.
These I place in the custody of the only department which I can still trust to act with some regard to the honour of our country.
Mycroft slipped them into the inner pocket of his coat with an air of grim satisfaction.
You have played a dangerous game, Sherlock. You may flatter yourself that you have won, but do not be surprised if there are those who bear you no goodwill in future.
I have never expected goodwill from those whose intrigues I thwart.
The minister made a last effort to reassert his dignity, declaring that nothing which had occurred could bind him officially, and that the memorandum must be regarded as private communications merely expressing personal opinions. Mycroft answered him with a courtesy as cold as ice.
You will find that these private communications will have very public consequences within a fortnight. You will also find that certain proposals which have lately been under consideration will disappear from the agenda as completely as if they had never been written.
With that he signalled to Lestrade, who stepped aside to allow the visitors to depart. They went out by the river door, and their footsteps died away upon the wharf, leaving us alone with Mrs. Bligg in the dim cavern of the warehouse.
You have kept your promise, Mr. Holmes, and I thank you. I never sought to drag great men into disgrace, but only to see that they did not trample my dead under their feet.
You have been a formidable antagonist, Mrs. Bligg, and might have done great harm had you chosen your allies less wisely. As it is, you have rendered a service both to your country and to your own, and I am proud to have stood at your side.
Lestrade, who had hitherto maintained a resentful silence, stepped forward with a queer mixture of chagrin and admiration upon his features.
I do not pretend to follow all the high politics of this affair, but I can see that there has been foul play and that you have brought the gentleman concerned to a pretty pass, Mr. Holmes. I suppose I must put it down as a case in which we assisted you, though it is not likely that I shall be able to mention it in my report.
There are some successes, Lestrade, which are more honourable for being unrecorded.
The inspector grunted and turned away, but I could see that in his heart he was not displeased to have been present at so unusual a scene. We left the warehouse together and made our way once more through the mist to the higher ground where cabs were to be found. Mycroft parted from us at a corner, promising to inform us in due season of the steps that would be taken in consequence of the memoranda. Mrs. Bligg returned to Baker Street with us and sat for a little while by our fire before setting off for her own modest lodging.
They may say what they please of me, Mr. Holmes, but I shall sleep tonight as I have not slept for 20 years. If they make good their word as you believe they will, then my husband will not lie under a false shame, and I shall know that I have not lived in vain.
You have paid a high price for your victory.
So have many poor souls whose names never are spoken in Parliament. I am only glad that for once the scale has dipped a little in our favour.
When she had gone, Holmes and I sat for some time in silence, watching the red glow of the embers. At last I could not refrain from expressing the admiration which I felt for the courage and tenacity of that solitary woman.
She was of the same clay as many another quiet worker in this great hive, Watson. The pity is that their virtues are exploited by those who sit above them while their sufferings are ignored.
Some days later, Mycroft paid us a brief visit. He informed us that a notice had appeared in a certain official record correcting the entry relating to the death of a minor clerk in the Foreign Office and acknowledging that he had been unjustly suspected. At the same time, a small pension had been granted to his widow under cover of a general scheme for the better provision of the families of deceased civil servants. He added that Sir Reginald Ashbridge had resigned all connection with public affairs upon the ground of ill health, and that he would shortly retire to a country house in the west, where he might end his days in peace. Of the projected 99-year lease, nothing more was heard, and the subject of the harbour dropped out of parliamentary talk as completely as if it had never been raised. The assault in the warehouse remained officially an unsolved crime attributed to persons unknown, possibly foreign agitators, and was soon displaced in the public memory by other events more fit for the columns of the daily press. During the months that followed, we saw little of Mrs. Bligg. I heard indirectly that she had left Sir Reginald's service when the house in Belgravia was broken up, and that she lived quietly with a widowed sister in a suburb, devoting herself to small charities and to the care of her sister's children. Once only she called upon us, bringing with her a basket of flowers for our table, and a shy country boy who stared round-eyed at Holmes as at some legendary hero. She spoke little of the past, and nothing at all of the paper which had given her such power, though I knew that Holmes had persuaded her to place the original in a certain secure custody from which it could not be withdrawn save with his knowledge. Sir Reginald recovered slowly from his injuries, though he was never again the active man he had been.
On more than one occasion Holmes and I visited him in his country retreat, where amid the quiet of his library he would talk with gratitude of the mysterious friends who had interposed to prevent him from taking a step which his conscience condemned.
He never guessed how near he had been to a more terrible fate than official disgrace, and we were content that he should remain in ignorance. As for the great men whose names had figured in Mrs. Bligg's paper, one disappeared discreetly from public life under cover of a diplomatic appointment abroad, while another suffered what the newspapers called a severe reverse in business and resigned his directorships. Only Mycroft and Holmes and one humble housekeeper knew the true inwardness of these changes. Looking back now across the years, I see that this adventure of the housekeeper's contract, though it involved no brilliant chase and no showy arrest, was in its essence one of the most characteristic of all the cases in which I followed my friend. It showed him standing as he loved best to stand, between the weak and the strong, between the obscure victim of injustice and the great organised powers by which injustice is too often made respectable. It showed also that singular mingling in him of cold reason and of chivalry that could move him to incur the enmity of high officials for the sake of a woman whose name would never be printed in any honours list. If the world has never known of this exploit, the blame lies partly with myself, for until now I have not dared to set it upon paper. Yet times have changed, and men are more ready perhaps to understand that the safety of a nation depends not only upon the skill of its statesmen and the strength of its fleets, but also upon the simple integrity of those who serve in the shadows. I have spoken much of others and little of myself in this narrative, yet you who have listened with such patience to my reminiscence will forgive an old campaigner if he adds a personal word before he lays down his pen. I thank you most sincerely for accompanying me to the end of this long and tangled story, and for giving of your time and attention to the chronicle of my dear friend's singular gifts. If the tale has pleased you, I would ask you as a small return to show your favour by giving a like to this recording, subscribing to this channel, and leaving a comment with your own reflections upon the case. Should you feel moved to support more directly a continuation of these untold cases of Sherlock Holmes, I would be deeply grateful if you would consider making a contribution by using the QR code, which you will find in the lower right of the screen, or by following the link that is placed in the description of this video. In that description, you will also discover paths that lead to other works from quite different series, which may perhaps afford you further interest and diversion when you are minded to seek it. For the present, I bid you a very cordial farewell, and I hope most earnestly that you will join Holmes and myself again when next another forgotten page from our old adventures is brought once more into the light.